How the Paramount deal could change the UFC forever.
TKO Holdings announced today as Paramount Plus will be the new exclusive home for the UFC starting in 2026.
I would have never predicted this in a million years.
It's happening. The UFC is headed to Paramount Plus.
Crazy. Absolutely huge deal, huge news.
They are leaving ESPN.
I never thought it would go this way, guys. This is a celebration.
7-year, $7.7 billion.
An average of $1.1 billion a year for 7 years in a row in this deal.
There's going to be no more pay-per-views. All the events are going to be available for everybody for free. Every pay-per-view, every fight card that they have from the Apex, everything is going to be available for free. It's an amazing deal.
This is the single greatest news that you have been given as fight fans, ever.
Recently, the UFC announced that they've signed a long-term contract with Paramount, and although there are a lot of similarities between how that contract will look compared to the current contract the UFC has with ESPN, there's certainly a couple of subtle differences that could change the company and the sport forever. But quickly, before we get the video started, my name is JuicyMMA, I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, as only 10% of you watching are actually subscribed. And also, if you want the inside scoop and extra breakdowns you won't see anywhere else, hit that join button, where you'll get members only videos, live streams, and also other fun perks like badges and emojis as well. But anyways, let's get into it. When you talk about the UFC's pairing with ESPN for so many years, it's been a bit up and down. On one hand, ESPN was perfect for the UFC because at the time when the UFC initially signed with ESPN, they still were a relatively younger sport and they still were a sport that was growing. So signing with a company like ESPN that was the brand name in sports was huge for the UFC. It was an opportunity to really take their sport and their company to the next level by being on the biggest platform for sports at the time. ESPN also provided the UFC with a lot of money, which is a huge benefit for the company, as then that allowed them to do some more ambitious and bigger things that they would have never been able to do prior. But although ESPN provided the UFC with a lot of benefits, at the same time there were some drawbacks, as a lot of fans, including myself, complained in depth about the ESPN app, as the app appeared to be pretty buggy and there just seemed to be a couple of different easy solutions ESPN could have made to fixing some of these issues, but over the years they were just never able to do so or just refused to make the adjustments. But outside of just the buggy app, another issue that a lot of fans had, including myself, was a whole pay-per-view model. Because when you talk about historically about UFC events, MMA events, or even boxing events, they always used to be on the pay-per-view model. When you have your higher level fights talking about championship fights, they usually tend to be on that pay-per-view. But as of late, when you look at boxing or even some other MMA organizations, they're more and more starting to head in the direction of monthly subscriptions as opposed to that pay-per-view model. If you look back to Canelo vs. Crawford, which is one of the bigger fights, at least on paper in the sport of boxing, it was not a pay-per-view. It was free to all Netflix users. Yes, you did have to pay that monthly subscription to be on Netflix, but once you paid that monthly subscription, there was no additional cost. But when you compare and contrast that to the UFC's current deal with ESPN, not only do you need to pay that monthly subscription fee for ESPN Plus, but also you have to pay an additional cost for each and every pay-per-view, which will cost you around $80 per event. So clearly the current UFC's deal with ESPN is outdated and was starting to become a problem. But a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why do I think the Paramount deal is going to change the UFC in the sport of MMA forever? Well, in my opinion, this comes down to a couple different factors, but the first and most obvious factor is the elimination of the pay-per-view model. Because it's been talked about in length that once the UFC moves on to Paramount in January of next year, there's not going to be those pay-per-views. Those number cards are just going to be that. They're just going to be numbered cards. There's not going to be that additional pay-per-view cost to watching some of these fights. Now, I know Dana has floated the idea around of potentially having a couple of pay-per-views still per year in the UFC, but even if that is true, even if there are 1 or 2 pay-per-views per year, it's a lot better than the current 13 model that we have now. And I think the elimination or partial elimination of the pay-per-view model is huge for 2 different reasons. The first is us hardcore UFC fans don't need to pay that pay-per-view for every single fight, and in turn, the product will be a lot more enjoyable enjoyable for us. But also another factor for why this is huge is I think it'll grow the sport. Because if you're someone that's not much of an MMA or a hardcore MMA fan at all, but you're someone that had Paramount Plus prior to the UFC moving over, and you happen to be scrolling on Paramount Plus during a UFC event, there is a chance that it'll spike your interest, you'll watch a card, and you'll turn into a hardcore fan. Whereas otherwise, if the UFC was behind that pay-per-view paywall, the chances of you paying $80 as a non-fan of MMA are extremely low. So I do think the fact that the UFC is eliminating the pay-per-view model is also going to attract additional fans. But the next factor for why I think the Paramount deal is going to change the UFC and the sport of MMA forever is due to the pressure. Because a lot of fans have talked in the past about the fact that when the UFC was with ESPN, ESPN never put a lot of pressure on them to put on good cards. And I think we really saw that over the years, but especially this year early on. In the first half of this year, a lot of the cards that the UFC were putting on were terrible. Their pay-per-views weren't good at all, their fight night events were at the apex literally every single time, and there just wasn't all that much excitement at the time, at least earlier on in the year. But now that the UFC is moving over to Paramount, Paramount is paying the UFC a significant amount of money, significantly more amount of money than ESPN was on their previous deal. So Paramount would be incentivized to make sure the UFC puts on a really good product and Paramount gets a real return on their money. And I think we're really starting to see that already, as when we talk about the first card with Paramount, that January card, Dana White has already talked about in length on how he's trying to work on that card to make it the best possible card he can put together. And I do expect for the first half of next year, all the cards are going to be very good, which would be a huge change from the UFC's time with ESPN. As at this point, how the UFC operates is at the first half of the year, they don't really put together great cards, whether you talk about pay-per-views or fight nights. Talking about the first 3 months, January, February, and March. But when you talk about the last half of the year, whether you talk about October, November, December, that's usually when the UFC puts on great cards, and that's what we're starting to see as of late with some of these recent fight announcements. But once the UFC officially makes the move to Paramount in January of next year, I think there's a much better chance that Paramount may put a lot more pressure on the UFC than ESPN did and force them to essentially put on great cards year-round. Because as I said before in the video, they're paying the UFC a lot of money and they have a vested interest in the success of the UFC. But I think the pressure that Paramount may or may not put on the UFC goes farther than just putting on great cards year-round. When you ask a lot of MMA fans what's the worst thing about the UFC, a lot of MMA fans will talk about the Apex. Yes, the Apex had a role at one point in time, but at this point, fans, including myself, would much prefer watch fights in arenas. Of course, you have your pay-per-views in arenas, but also we would prefer to see these fight nights in arenas. It just adds to the excitement. But after this Paramount deal was announced, the UFC brass has already been talking about the fact that they are looking to expand the capacity of the Apex. So yes, we're not completely getting away from the Apex, but if the capacity was significantly higher than what it currently is, I don't think many fans would complain as much about the Apex. And I think that could be another potential sign that some of the pressure that Paramount may be putting on the UFC is actually working, and a lot of the things that us MMA fans have problems with the UFC could potentially get solved under this Paramount deal. And of course, not even to mention that I do think fighter pay will increase. Now, will it increase to a point where it will be fair in terms of the revenue splits? I don't think so, at least immediately, but at the end of the day, the fact that the UFC is making so much more money under this Paramount deal as compared to the amount of money they were getting under the ESPN deal will most likely lead to higher payouts for some of these fighters. So even if it isn't fair in terms of the revenue splits, at least these guys will be able to make more money than what they're currently making, and any sort of additional money these guys could make would certainly be a benefit for the fighters. So overall, I do think this Paramount deal will change the sport of MMA and the company of the UFC forever, and I think there'll be a lot of positives that come alongside with this, not just for the fans, but also potentially for the fighters as well. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Paramount deal is going to be a positive for the UFC and for us UFC fans, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.